Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Christina Victor and Director of the Institute of Health, Medicine and Environments. And this is our second interdisciplinary masterclass this term. For those of you who came to the first one, that we were focusing on engaging with the public and thinking about the different types of publics that we might want to include and influence and engage with as part of our research. And so in our second session this term, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Justin Fisher, who is Director of the Brunel Policy Unit, or a title something like that, who's going to introduce us to thinking about a different group of people who we might wish to engage with as part of our research, and that's those involved in policy. So we'll run the seminar the same way we did last time. Justin will speak for however long he's going to speak for, and then we can take questions at the end. So without further ado, over to you, Justin.
Thanks very much, Christina. So what I want to do is firstly talk about, I'm going to talk about two things: working with user groups and how to get your research noticed, and then writing for the particular audiences. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So I think what's very important when we're thinking about these, okay, first thing I think to bear in mind is that there's sometimes a temptation to think that our research won't be of interest or to use or of use to policymakers. And I think it's really important to stress this point at the start, that actually a lot of what we do in a wide range of disciplines can make a really positive contribution to policy, to legislation, and to public life more generally. And what I've been struck with over the years of doing a lot of work with politicians, with legislators, with policymakers, is that they really value the research-led insights that we can provide. So they see academic research quite rightly as being objective, rigorous, thorough, and something that can make a real contribution. So what I want to do today is talk about four things: co-design, working with policymakers and indeed third sector organizations, talking about the benefits of doing that, but also some notes of caution that I think are worth bearing in mind. How to get your research noticed by people to whom you can make a contribution. So they could be policymakers, legislators, etc. How you write for these audiences, and then critically, how the university can support you in getting your message across. So let me start with co-design. Now, there's an intranet site that's associated with these seminars, and I've sent some documents to that, and that's going up shortly. And what you'll find in there are some examples of some co-design work I've done, as well as a spin-off article, which I'm going to refer to in a minute. So if you get a chance, you can have a look at that and see the sorts of work that can be done. But let's just kick off with the benefits. Now, I'm basing this on work I've done with the Electoral Commission at every general election in Britain since 2005, and also on the 2016 referendum. And I've done a lot of work with them evaluating how well the election worked on the ground, plugging into a survey that I do for election agents at every general election. So these are the people who work for the candidates, and it allows the Electoral Commission to evaluate how well things are going, how the administration of the election is going, and so on and so forth. And we can track over time how things have improved or declined, as well as capture the extent to which people use the services of the Electoral Commission. So I've done that several times with them. The other example to draw upon is some work, co-design work I did with the Joseph Rowntree Trust around an election, where they were looking at how parties, the extent to which parties engaged in negative campaigning. And what we did was we set up a group of people around the country in around 220 constituencies, and they collected every leaflet that came through their door, sent them back to us, and we coded detail in the leaflet, so we could capture what sorts of policies the parties were talking about, whether they were engaging in positive or negative campaigning, and so on. So a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about that in a while. But let's just talk about some generic benefits of co-design. First and foremost, I think what co-design can produce are real benefits in exploring areas of which you maybe have previously been unaware. So if I take the Joseph Rowntree Trust example, it has never occurred to me that you could collect all, examples of the leaflets that went through people's door. It's much easier now with digitization, but then we very much had an army of volunteers, prepaid envelopes, etc., and just sending them back. And something of which I was unaware, but I actually produced some very interesting outcomes. Similarly, being able to capture whether or not people on the ground in elections thought the elections were run well, whether they thought there was fraud involved, was also very interesting and very sobering, particularly when you compared their opinions with those of the general public. So it gives you insights into key issues. But critically, it can also generate data which you may be able to use for other projects. So the work I've done with the Electoral Commission over time allowed me to run a project looking at data from 3 elections, 2010, 2015, and 2017, and evaluate in what kinds of places did agents think there was more or less electoral fraud, and in what kinds of places were they more or less satisfied with the administration of their of the elections. And I've put this article, I've sent this article to Anna, it'll be up on the intranet, and I would urge you to have a look at it, because it's a kind of interesting example of how you can use the data from a co-design project and then produce something that's actually quite new, which I then fed back into the Electoral Commission. Because what was very clear is that far from there being a problem with perceptions of fraud across the whole country, they were very localized around very urban areas, but also what these data showed was that people who thought there was more fraud were more likely to have lost the election. People who were more satisfied were more likely to have won. So it was a combination of things, as well as seat marginality. So you're able to use the data for other projects, as well as the initial project that you worked with the people on. Fourthly, and I think this is important for any kind of research, it's another set of informed eyes. So they ask questions that academic colleagues might not necessarily ask you, and therefore you can help improve your understanding in the way you put the research across. It can produce follow-up work. As I said, I've done this for the Electoral Commission at every election since 2005, and it's because I worked with them closely on that they then commissioned me to do the work on the administration of the 2016 referendum. So it can lead to further contracts, which opens up lots more opportunity. And of course, it can give you fame and glory, which is always lovely. So co-design has a lot of benefits. It can get you to do work in really interesting areas, but it can also have spin-off benefits in terms of other academic articles. But a note of caution, and this is something that I've experienced, that I've built up over many years of working with outside organizations. The first is that actually my experience is there's often less understanding of what a contract may buy. So the understanding of what research can reasonably be undertaken for the money is not as well developed outside higher education as within. And I have to say that universities are much, much better at costing the real level of research. I think this is an important consideration. There are times, and it becomes easier once you've been doing this for longer, when you do have to say no. You can only do this to a certain level based on the time scale and the amount of money that you're providing. Timescales, these can be very, very tight. so the stuff we do on the Electoral Commission, for the Electoral Commission, this needs to be reported back, the initial results within 6 weeks of the election, because the Commission itself has certain reporting standards. So that means we have to do interim reports before we produce the final report when all of our data are in. But these timelines, it's worth bearing in mind, can you deliver them? Again, when we did the project on the referendum, this needed to be turned around very quickly. So when you're thinking of working with and doing co-design with people, think about whether you can deliver to the timeline that they want, bearing in mind all the other pressures that you've got. In my case, for example, elections have an awful habit of falling around the time of exams. So that causing me a great deal of difficulty. In conjunction with this, and this goes back to the understanding of what the real cost of research, I've often found that people I've done co-design with think that you can produce more cases than you can reasonably deliver. This is particularly the case if you're doing qualitative research, bearing in mind the amount of time it takes to set up, conduct, transcribe, and analyze the data from qualitative studies. So this was a good example of where you had to say, actually, no, you can't have an additional 10 cases that I can fit in 2 days. That's simply not possible. So do be on the lookout for that. And bear in mind that if you don't deliver what they want, then they'll be fed up. So it's much better to say, no, we're able to do this in this timescale for this amount of money. Now, a particular bugbear of mine, but one I know that's not necessarily shared by others, is the open-ended question in surveys. Now, from my perspective, these are hugely problematic for 2 reasons. Firstly, on a practical level, they take an age to code, and this really adds to the cost of doing survey analysis for people, because rather than having closed questions where they're easily coded and you can start doing analysis relatively quickly, once the data are in, you have to go through open-ended questions manually, and it takes an age. And in the example that you'll see on the intranet, there's the answers to an open-ended question where you can see that there are a wide variety of different questions, which leads me to the second criticism I have, which is that often if you provide no guidance in a survey about the types of answers that you want and have open-ended ones, the data that you get back are often next to useless because there's no uniformity in terms of the kinds of clusters of answers that you're looking for, and you end up artificially fitting the answers into little boxes. And that, of course, takes away some of the scientific element. Now, I am aware that some people rather like open-ended questions in surveys. Personally, if you're doing a contract with a short timeline for delivery, I would avoid them because they're more trouble than they're worth. And I also don't think that you get a great deal out of them. Next point is, of course, the perils of questionnaire design by committee. Now, obviously, in co-design, you have to follow the brief, depending on whose project it is, but never underestimate the temptation of co-designers to want to have their pet question, however badly designed that pet question is. So you need to be firm on what is a good question and what should go in the survey. Being clear about the question design. Remember, you're being brought in or you're working with an organization because you're the expert on gathering these data. So be very clear about that. And this falls on whose project is it? If it's a contract, then obviously you have to take account of the needs of the client. If you're working in co-design, you need to be clear what the project is seeking to do. And as a sort of final point here is, remember that you can end up producing results that your co-designer doesn't like. Now, this happened with the Joseph Rowntree Trust. The Joseph Rowntree Trust in this particular election had gone into the project hoping to find that one party, in this case the Conservative Party, was engaging in much more negative campaigning than the others. In fact, what we found in this particular election was that the party engaging in the most negative campaigning was the Liberal Democrats. And actually both Labour and the Conservatives were fairly even in the way they campaigned. And these results went down like a lead balloon with the Joseph Rowntree Trust. But you have to be pure to your craft and say, this is how we've done the project, and these are the answers that we found, but be prepared for some kickback. So co-design is great, it's well worth doing, but be aware of some of the problems. So let's move on to getting your research noticed. Second part of today's presentation. And the first thing is that you need to be proactive. Think about the barriers to other people knowing about your research. And by other people, I mean policymakers, legislators, pressure groups, etc. So that there are at least 3 barriers to people knowing about your research. One is the cost of locating it. So if it's on open access, well, you've eliminated the cost. But can the research be easily found? Even if it's on open access, how would anyone know it's there? If it's not on open access, then of course there's the cost of the article. The second thing is the length of the piece. We're conditioned in academia to write articles of around between 8,000 and 10,000 words. But most of the time, the people with who you might want to get your research out to haven't got the time or indeed the inclination to read 8,000 to 10,000 words. They want something brief. And the third thing is, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way, but the level of understanding. Academic articles are written for academic audiences with an assumption about the kind of things an assumption about the knowledge and understanding of the things we're talking about. Well, outside of academia, that might not exist. So in effect, just by relying on your articles existing, you're putting barriers in the way of people finding out about the interesting findings that you've produced. The cost, the length, the level of understanding. So you've got to be proactive. So what I've identified here are some ways in which you can get your research noticed, some of which will be statements of the blindingly obvious, but obviously there are some other ones that I think we can pick up on. So first and foremost, something most of us do, conference presentations. These are good because they help develop an identity of who we are, what we're about, but also can lead to recommendations from others. If someone's seen your paper, they get approached for some advice on a particular issue, and they say, well, I can't help, but you should talk to X. I saw her give a paper at a conference, it was excellent. You should go and speak with her. So conference presentations are really good. And some conferences, of course, attract outside stakeholders as well as academics. Secondly, information and stakeholder events. These are ones where either funding councils or government departments will set up events to talk about the new work that they're looking to fund, or new work that they are interested in. And here, it's worth being proactive. Attend them, speak at them, and again, establish an identity in the area of someone who it's worth listening to. Thirdly, interact with other external influencers. So on any particular policy area, it won't just be academics trying to make a case. There'll be various pressure groups, think tanks, relevant industry bodies, or charities. So it's worth working with them if you think that you can get your message across alongside them, or use them to get your message across. Make them aware of the research. Like policymakers, they'll always be interested in new work, particularly if it tallies with their view of the world. So a second set of ways to get your research noticed. And this refers to a lot of work we do with Brunel Public Policy in encouraging colleagues to respond to inquiries and respond to consultations. And I think here it's really important both to do this, to respond to inquiries and consultations, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how you do that in a while, but to bear in mind that the timeline for responding to inquiries and consultations can sometimes be very challenging. So typically there will be a consultation and they want responses in 2 to 3 weeks. And this can be a problem. What you have to work with is you have to think about a different way of working. If you were asked to produce an academic article in that period of time, of course, it would be almost impossible to do. But what you're doing here is drawing and summarizing on your research. But bear in mind, this can be very challenging to do. But actually, once you get down to it and once you get better at it, you can produce responses relatively quickly. Now, in these inquiries and consultations, and this is something I'm going to touch on when talking about writing for these audiences, it's important to engage as much as possible in constructive criticism. So the particular government or the particular department that's looking to have an inquiry or a consultation may be doing things with which you don't agree. But the best way of trying to improve that outcome is not by attacking them, but by saying, well, actually, this wouldn't work as it stands. This would be a better way of doing it. So, for example, I've recently appeared in front of Public Bill Committee and a select committee talking about a bill that's currently going through Parliament called the Elections Bill, where there are some good ideas and some ideas with which I have no sympathy. But even on the ones with which I have no sympathy, I've explained why I think they're a bad idea, but then also said, well, if you're going to do this, this is a better way of going about it. And that is more likely to get a hold and more likely to deliver some kind of change. Media inquiries. Lots of academics get involved in media work, and it's a great thing to do, not least because sometimes they give you a little bit of money to do it. But again, the timeline can be really challenging. With inquiries and consultations, you may have 2 or 3 weeks in which to respond. For media inquiries, it can be in under an hour. And so you've got to bear in mind that if you're going to respond to these, you have to do so quickly or not do so at all. Simply say that you can't do it. It's a good thing to do. It's fun to do, but the timelines, as I say, can be challenging. They can occur outside normal working hours, and they can occur at very inconvenient times. I've been on the way to the garden centre with my wife and suddenly had to do a detour to Sky Studios to do a quick interview. Things like that. It's worth doing, but remember the timelines can be very, very challenging. And if you want to get involved in media work, that's something that you've got to accept and got to be quite flexible. And if you can't afford the time to go somewhere, one of the kind of upsides, if you like, of the dreadful time we've had over the last 2 years is that more and more media organizations are happy to do media appearances online through things like Zoom or whatever. But also if you're on campus, we have a good radio studio here, and I've done a lot of radio appearances from the lecture center. So you can fit it in with your day a lot better. So do think about that. And on the media, an important point, I think, if you haven't done media work before, be prepared to start small. You're not suddenly going to be asked to write an op-ed in the Financial Times, but you might get asked to do something, say a few words on BBC Radio Gloucestershire. And it's worth doing. I've got nothing against BBC Radio Gloucestershire. I've done a lot of work with them. My point is that start small, you get experience and you build up to other radio stations. But what it also means is that even if you're doing a small local radio station, you get on the system. So if you're on the BBC system, BBC local radio, you get picked up by all the other local radio stations around. Your name is on the system. Similarly with independent radio, there's a network, which means, for example, that I often get asked to do things for radio stations in Northern Ireland, a place where I've never actually been. So it's good to start small and things can develop from there. Okay, third set of slides on getting your research noticed. And this is blogs, I think, are a fantastic way of highlighting new findings, which can be circulated very, very easily, especially if they're on an established platform. So I work in political science, and the most established platforms for us, there's one run LSE on LSE Politics and Policy. There's the Political Studies Association, but there'll be a whole series of others. And the beauty of blogs is it eliminates many of the costs associated with people finding out about your research. People can view them for free. Okay, so there's no charge associated. The length typically around 800 to 1,000 words, so very digestible. And they're always written in a way that makes the research findings very, very easy to understand. So they're highly accessible. And I'm always amazed at the number of people who read blogs, who read posts and get a lot of ideas from them. I did something in a recent election, it wasn't a blog as such, but it was along the lines of a blog for the BBC website. It was on campaigning. And it was written in a very accessible way, showing the clear findings about how parties campaign. And it had 250,000 views in the first 48 hours. So which, you know, I would never get that many people reading my articles. I'd be lucky if I got 25 people reading my full-length articles. So it's a brilliant way of getting your research across in a way that can be circulated in an extraordinarily easy way, particularly online. In addition to that, you can also produce press releases or policy briefs headlining your findings. It's a good idea sometimes to send easy summaries of your results to the press, headlining your findings. The journalists are not interested in how you gathered the research. What they're interested in is the takeaway message. In my case, do constituency level campaignings deliver electoral payoffs? And so you can headline your findings and get those across. And finally, on this section, I would really urge you to use Twitter to promote your results. I thought I knew about social media until we hired somebody for the journal I edit to do our social media, and I realized I knew absolutely nothing. But what my colleague showed me was how you could use Twitter effectively and creatively to really promote the results to as wide an audience as possible. And what it's meant in the journal that I edit is that we've changed our impact factor. We've tripled our impact factor in 12 months. And that's largely as a result of the articles that we've promoted on Twitter being picked up, being cited more, and it's led to a whole series of articles that we've published being picked up by the press. We use a whole series of techniques, not just Twitter. We do little podcasts associated with the papers. So people record a podcast of no more than 140 seconds. We do interviews with our authors and we tweet those out. But Twitter is an enormously powerful tool to get your results out there, both to other academics, but also to media sources, as well as policymakers and legislators. So use Twitter. If you have a Twitter account yourself, use it. If you don't, set one up. But also, as I'll show you, use the university services to help you in this respect. So how do you write for the audiences? Well, I've got what I call 8 rules for thinking about writing, responding to a consultation. But it's not just about consultations, but the ideas any kind of piece of work around trying to get your research out there to legislators and policymakers. So rule 1, always respond to the questions that are being asked. Now, what you'll find with consultations, inquiries, is that typically there are a particular set of terms of reference in which the department or committee will be interested. They might not be the questions that you think are the most important ones, but they're the questions that they want answers to. So frame everything around the questions that they had set. Secondly, use comparisons. The number of times I've been asked as a witness in Parliament about what do they do in other countries, what policymakers and legislators are really interested in seeing is have other companies, have other countries, other local authorities, organizations, have they tried a particular solution to the question in hand? And was it successful? What can you learn from that? And so whereas you don't just simply take policy off the shelf and transfer it over, comparisons can be incredibly useful to show maybe that some countries tried this and it wasn't successful, or one local authority tried this and it led to certain improvements, which might be transferable in a different setting. So comparisons are always good. Rule 3, never waste a good metric. Now, obviously, not all policy solutions lend themselves to simple measurement. But if you have a metric that illustrates your point, use it, okay? So we have one that we use on campaigning that shows that had a particular party not engaged in a certain amount of campaigning, their share of the vote would have fallen by 2 percentage points. Okay, it's a nice metric that really gets the point of what we're saying across. So if you've got a good metric, use it. It's always picked up by legislators and policymakers. Fourthly, research insights from related areas can be really helpful. Now, what I mean by that is that you may not be doing research on the precise area that where you're asked to contribute, but actually a lot of areas are comparable with each other. I'll give you an example. So a few years ago, I was asked to do some work on regulating lobbying, which obviously has again become a very topical issue. Now, I hadn't done research on lobbying per se, on the regulation of lobbying per se, but I'd done a lot of work on the regulation of how parties are funded. And actually, there were a lot of insights from that were directly relevant to questions about lobbying, questions about transparency, for example, and what transparency can achieve and what it can't, what are the limits, and so on and so forth. And so what I found was I was able to draw on this related area and generate some new insights into the regulation of lobbying. Similarly, you may be working in a cognate area, and if you can see how they're related to the question in hand, do use them, because it'll be a nice comparison. Did the use of transparency work in this area? Well, if it did, there's every reason to think that it could work in this particular area under investigation. Fifth, rule 5, politics matters. Now, what I mean by that is that you may or may not agree with the direction of a travel of a government, of a local authority, of a particular government department, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean you say you shouldn't challenge ideas. You absolutely should challenge ideas. But what you're seeking to do is challenge some of the underlying ideas rather than rubbish them. And so what you're seeking to do is not engage in an exercise in trying to establish intellectual supremacy. What you're trying to do is improve policy and policy outcomes. So sometimes you have to work with people whose general views you don't agree with. But actually what you're trying to do is make some improvement. And on improvement and change, what you always need to accept, rule 6, is that any change that you can make is likely to be, in the grand scheme of things, fairly small. But that's still a really, really important improvement. Even if you change a tiny thing, that's a change for the better. So don't go in thinking that you're going to change the entire direction of travel. But if you can make a small improvement, you've done something very, very important. So accept that any change will be small. Rule 7, a rule I've lived with by for many years. Why not do nothing? Now, this is, I think, is a very important option in terms of thinking about whether any change will produce better outcomes than if you simply did nothing. Now, I started developing this approach when I was a consultant to the committee on, to an inquiry about party finance run by the then Department of Constitutional Affairs. And they were looking at whether or not party finance regulation should be changed. And what I persuaded them to do was to say, actually, they need to evaluate whether or not doing nothing, making no change at all, would be a better outcome. And sometimes doing nothing is a better outcome. In a recent inquiry I've done about electoral law, for example, I've made the case that although the status quo on a particular topic, it's called notional expenditure, is imperfect, the alternatives are even worse. So the best thing to do is to make no change. So never rule out doing nothing. And actually, it's a really good discipline. Even if making a change is a good thing, it's a good discipline to show how much it's going to improve things. The tendency is always to stick with the status quo, but evaluating the pros and cons of doing nothing can give you a good indication of whether or not change is a good idea. And then finally, rule 8, feasibility matters. You should always aim to show not only why your idea is a good one, but what would be needed to deliver it. It's no use saying, in order, suggesting a policy that's saying, in order to do this, we need to double the amount that goes into universities or the health service or whatever, because that's not going to happen. You need to think about the feasibility of delivering the proposals that you've made. Okay, so those are the 8 golden rules, but what about other things to bear in mind? So what I've put this under is make it easy 1 and 2. Making it easy first. As I've said, in any response, you need to follow the terms of reference that have been framed. So you need to state clearly which aspects of the terms of reference of the inquiry or which inquiry questions you're focusing upon. You don't have to focus on all of them. A few years ago, I responded to a select committee inquiry focusing only on one question, because it seemed to me that that was a particularly important one. This was the one where I advocated doing nothing. So it's really important that you say which of the terms of reference you're focusing on. Make it easy for the reader. Second, when you structure your response, structure it so you reflect the terms of reference or questions to which you're responding. So lots of subheadings saying, you know, this is with a heading that says, you know, this is question 1, blah, blah, blah. You know, should the Electoral Commission have more political control? And then your answers to that, et cetera, et cetera. Make it easy. And then thirdly, remember that you're almost certainly not writing for experts. You're the expert on this. You've done all the detailed research. So when writing for that, make it easy and make it understood. That should be your golden rule. Never assume that people know what you're talking about, because they won't have the background, they won't have the expertise, and so on and so forth. So make it as easy to understand as possible. And one way of doing that is the use of the executive summary. I'll explain what the pictures are in a minute. An executive summary at the start of your response is extremely useful. It basically tells people exactly in the first few lines what you're saying, what your conclusions are, and what your recommendations are. All the detail follows. So a good executive summary should allow people to just read a few bullet points and know exactly what you're saying and what you're recommending. And they can then go on to read the detail in the rest of your submission. I refer to this as the Volavon Principle. So the picture on the top at the top there is of some delightful mushroom volavons. I asked my students about volavons last week, and they looked at me blankly, and I realized this was aging me. So for those of you who didn't grow up in the 70s and early 80s, volavons are a rather delicious snack you often used to get at weddings and at Christmas. And the reason I use this is to think about when you're at a family party and you're talking to someone who's interested in your work, and you happen to mention you made a submission to a particular select committee, and they say, okay, oh, what did you say? And you realize that all that stands between you and getting tucked into the Volavon is a very quick description of your main conclusions and recommendations. And the sooner you can get those out, the sooner you can get tucked in to that delicious puff pastry and mushroom in sauce. So it's a good way of basically putting the conclusion right at the start and headlining your findings. So make it easy. Number 3, just some general style tips. Short paragraphs are generally better because you're not seeking to construct a work of great literature, it's a response. So keep it brief. Use numbered paragraphs. It makes it much easier for the reader to use. So when they're going through the evidence, they can say, oh, I see this point that Victor makes in paragraph 3.2 is much better than saying, what do you think of this point that Victor makes on page 3 about 4 lines up? Make it as easy as possible. Often when you're writing responses, you'll often think about the likelihood or probability that something may happen. And the worst thing you can do, I think, is use a phrase like this could happen, because there's real imprecision there. So I would urge you to use a tool like this probability yardstick, which I'm going to show you in a second, which I think is a good way of framing some of the things that you speak about. And just as using a good metric can help sum up your argument, there's also a neat phrase can be very helpful, and it's often more likely to be cited by politicians in their final report. So this is one that I did recently on in the light of the remember David Cameron had got into some difficulty after having worked for a lobbyist after he'd stopped becoming Prime Minister, and one of the select committees decided to conduct a review of lobbying. Now, I made a submission to this, having worked on it before, and what was very clear to me when thinking about regulating lobbyists is the worst kind of discussion you can get into is whether some lobbyists are goodies and other lobbyists are baddies. And typically when we talk about lobbyists, people often regard lobbyists in the private sector as being baddies and people lobbying for charities as being goodies. Now, you may well think that, but in terms of regulation, you're never going to get anywhere with that kind of perspective. So it seemed to me one of the things to nail down was to say that actually, if you're going to regulate this, you've got to accept that there are not good kinds of lobbyists or bad kinds of lobbyists. There are just lobbyists, because there are some unethical lobbyists for charities, as well as there are some perfectly ethical lobbyists in the private sector. And what you're seeking to do is make the system better for everybody. So I'm quite pleased with that phrase, and it neatly summed up my view of how best to go about regulating lobbying in the light of David Cameron's difficulties. Now, the probability yardstick was something I referred to when thinking about the probability of something happening. And this is actually a yardstick that's used by intelligence services, but it could apply across any policy area. And what this helps do is introduce some level of precision, or a greater level of precision, in terms of the likelihood of something happening. Now, unless you're using some quite sophisticated modeling techniques, you won't be able to evaluate whether something is 55% likely to happen. But actually it gives you a guide of, when you're saying this might happen, well, what do you mean? Do you mean there's a remote chance of it happening, in which case it's worth the risk? Do you think it's actually, it's highly likely to happen? There's a chance it won't, but it's more than likely going to happen. So you'd say highly likely. And it just introduces a better sense for the reader of the likelihood of something occurring. If, for example, in the discussions about COVID, if people don't get their booster vaccination, what is the likelihood of being an additional wave of COVID happening? So here they would have models where they have the percentage likelihood, but expressed in language, they would have a better sense of whether something is going to happen. So I would urge you to use tools like this. So finally, on this section, I want to talk about how your evidence is used and some things to bear in mind. And it can be frustrating, but these are some things you've just got to accept. Not all of your arguments, however strong, will be used. And sometimes what you regard as a very strong argument may be ignored. And let me give you an example of this. So when I did work for the Electoral Commission about the 2016 referendum, what was very clear from that work was that the spending limits for the various types of participants were set at a level that they made spending limits meaningless. And so it seemed to me that this was something that had really failed, not in that was general legislation that was used in that referendum, not something specific. So I was called before a select committee for the Scottish Parliament, where they were looking to introduce their own legislation in advance of what we expect will be another referendum on independence. And I made the point that actually, if they're going to do this, they ought to revisit the spending limits for the various participants in the referendum, pointing out that all the research about the 2016 referendum had suggested that those limits were meaningless. It was a strong empirical argument, based on lots of analysis, and the Scottish Parliament just decided to ignore it because it didn't fit with their view of things. They said, well, that might have happened in a UK referendum, but things are very different in Scotland. Well, there's no evidence for that whatsoever, but nevertheless, they decided to ignore it. It was a pain, but that's the thing to remember, is that all decisions by policymakers and legislators are political. They won't all be based on the kind of reason and empirical work that you do. You're simply making a case, you're trying to improve it. So those are things you need to bear in mind. And it goes back to my point that any change you make is likely to be small. So what I want to do finally now, before we have a chance for some questions, is to look at how the university can support you in doing all of these things. So firstly, if you work on co-design, and if you're doing something on contracts, you should work very closely with RSDO, because they will be incredibly helpful in helping you get the contract right, dealing with timelines, dealing with things like VAT and so on and so forth. So make sure you work with RSDO. They've got a lot of experience in this and they're brilliant at doing it. Secondly, contact us at Brunel Public Policy, because we can help you with drafting and preparing your responses. So every week, for example, we get a digest of all the new consultations and inquiries that are out, and we contact the various academics around the university and say, have you seen this? Would you be interested in making a response? And what we do is many of the colleagues who want to respond send us drafts, and we help them prepare their responses in a way that's likely to get their research noticed. So a resource for you here, and do please use it. We put a lot of examples up on our website of responses that people have made. So you can see, look at examples and see how others have done it. The press office is brilliant at drafting press releases for you. And they will help with this and help you get the message across in 100 words. They're very, very good at this. And they're also very, very good at tweeting out your results. So the press office have dedicated people there who work on promoting your research on the university's website in a nice digestible form, but also tweeting out the results to a very, very wide public. So use the press office. They're very, very good at doing this, and they're very, very good at getting your research into a digestible format to promote to others. Take advantage of the periodic media training opportunities that the university puts on. They're really, really helpful, and they show you how to work in media situations. And in the future, we're hoping to hire a policy brief writer in the coming months. Once we've got that person in place, or those people in place, use us to help you draft a policy brief, summarizing your research and getting it out to the right people. One final thing, it's absolutely essential that you log all the impact that you have, even if you're not sure about it, with your college research office. Now, I don't know the names of the people in every college, but in my own college, it's Victoria Schubert. And even if you're not sure, your college research office will log this detail so that if you come to be part of an impact case study, or if we're simply referring to it in the statements on the ref, we've got all the detail, because people always have a habit of forgetting stuff because it's several years ago. So log all impact, even if you're not sure, with your college research office. So I hope everybody's found that useful. I'm very happy to take questions now and indeed afterwards if you want to email me. And I hope this has been a useful digest of the various things to bear in mind. So at this point, I'll hand back to Christina.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's really interesting. I've never been to a select committee, but I have been to all party parliamentary groups to discuss research things. And I feel my career really peaked when I went to talk about loneliness and pet ownership at the all-party parliamentary group on cats. Who knew there was one? But I also think as well, your point about having if you like, a strap line that summarizes your research is really powerful. So in my own area, a systematic review was published in about 2013, where the author had calculated some odds ratios for mortality for loneliness, and come up with this strapline that loneliness was worse for you than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which was a generous interpretation of their analysis. But that is just repeated ad nauseum anytime anybody ever talks about loneliness, and I just quietly implode in the corner because I've given up arguing with them now. So those kinds of things are pretty powerful. So do we have any questions for Justin from our audience there? I can only see a few of you on. Dorothy has got a.
Okay, I got one question, which is about the contacting the media, the press officers. Every time when I got a paper accepted, I contacted them, but I realized from their reception and their response to my kind of email, I don't know whether we need to take their response into account. Sometimes I get this, great, this is something that we can certainly help you to write about. And sometimes I get this very cold response in terms of it kind of made me think whether they've already seen it, that this particular research finding is not as newsworthy as the other ones that I did in the past.
I mean, I think, it's true that not all papers are as newsworthy as each other. And it's also true that sometimes events can take over. So in the height of COVID, much to my amazement, getting any traction on things about funding parties was quite difficult. Who'd have thunk it? but actually, timing can be really, really important. And even if it's not part of the news cycle now, it can be one later on. So, stuff I've done on lobbying, which actually coincided with the pandemic, is now, really, really high on the agenda as a result of recent events. So it's worth going back. And also, I mean, I've always found our press office really receptive, but like journalists, they're time poor. And so the easier you can make it for them and say, okay, this is the headline takeaway, the more they're likely to be able to see the story. Not for you to write the press release for them, but to say, okay, here are my key findings. And in your one, it might be to do with trust in business or something like that. And if that kind of strapline, like the one that Christina was referring to, can be really helpful as a hook on which to hang it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a very famous example in political science. So some colleagues conducted a study of party members. And one of the throwaway findings they had was that the average age of a Conservative Party member at that time was 64. So their key sort of takeaway point was actually the problem for the Conservative Party at the time, this was back in the 90s, was that their membership was literally dying out. It wasn't being renewed. And that number, that goes back to my never waste a good metric, that has been quoted ad infinitum, even though the more recent research has said that the average age is now much, much lower. So thinking about the key takeaway, I think, is important, and make it as easy as possible. I mean, for the colleagues in the press office. But I mean, sometimes what we think is exciting isn't always something that's going to be newsworthy. And much as I'd like, and I say this as someone who works on party finance, which is a guaranteed way to clear the room at a party. The only time anyone ever wants to talk to you about it is when there's a scandal. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be disheartened by that, but also think about, how you can make it easier for them as well as the journalists.
Yeah.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, great. I think I think you mentioned the conversation on your. Did you mention the conversation on your list there? I think that's a great.
Man has, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation is a terrific vehicle, a bit like a blog, and gets a lot of coverage, not only because lots of people read it, but because lots of people tweet it out. I never underestimate the impact of making something digestible in a Twitter message alongside the detail in the blog. I mean, this is what we do on our journal, and it's been absolutely fantastic about getting the central message out there. You've got to do a bit of work on that, but if you can use Twitter and the conversations, it's another great vehicle. And I see that Seb here has the media relations team says that the press office offers support with pitches to the conversation and media training and advice. So it's well worth doing. I didn't mention the conversation.
Sorry,
but it's very important.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good vehicle. Of course, my heart sinks when you mention Twitter, because. Well,
that's because we're of a certain age.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, dinosaur talking.
Yeah, I mean, it gets. I mean, even if you're not confident yourself, the university is very good at it. And if you happen to be in CBAS, we have a social media person who tweets out research. It's the same person who works for the journal. So if you're in CBAS, you're lucky. But also, this person works for Brunel Public Policy, so we can also do it through that. So if you want something tweeted out and it's got policy implications, send it to me and I'll get it tweeted out for you.
Yeah, good. So I don't have to do it. Is it Ascar?
Yes, it is.
Ah, there you are.
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you, Justin. Interesting presentation. My dilemma is simply, how do you determine what is relevant research, study, whatever it might be? Because my studies are not traditional. So I'm not studying medicine, law, or engineering, business. And for me, I think part of the concern is is this worthy of being out there? Is it worthy of the media? Is it worthy of being read or understood by others? It's of interest to me, particularly, but it might not be to others. And so I think the dilemma for me is the consideration of, partly it not being accepted, which is neither here or there, but more so to do with what is valuable and what is not.
I mean, the answer, I think it's an interesting question, and I think all of us have asked ourselves the very self-same question. The fact that you're here, being paid to do it, means that people think your research is important, and actually, people are always. I'm always quite struck when you talk to policymakers that they really want to get research from a whole range of fields. So one of the things we've been doing with Brunel Public Policy is plugging colleagues from across the university into policy-making areas. And some disciplines are likely to be more active than others. So we currently have a lot with from law, for example, but we've had people from a whole range, from every single college, and I think almost every single department make some contribution to particular policy areas if it's something that's been relevant to their research. So if you're doing research in an area, I think it's worth promoting. Now, people may not take notice, but it may be a slow burner. It may be something that you put out there and it gets picked up later on, and then you can re-promote it. So I do think it's worth doing. I mean, I of course wonder if anybody's interested. When I talk to my children about my research, they have that reaction that younger people have when talking to their parents, and they glaze over, and I think, oh, is it all worth it? But of course, somebody's interested, and somebody will always be working on the area that you're working on. So yeah, I would strongly encourage you to do that. I've got a question here, Christina, from Josephine about mini podcasts, and she said, did you mean to say 140 seconds? And the answer to that question is yes. We deliberately went with 140 seconds, partly because we were tweeting them out, but partly because actually the thing that we often do as academics, and I'm trying to say this without irony, speak for too long, okay? And you lose people. And actually, if you can get your message across in 140 seconds, the key things about your article, it piques people's interests. So it's a nice discipline. We said 140 because at the time there were 140 characters on Twitter, but it's a really good way of doing it. For example, when we hire people, one of the things I always used to do when I was a head of department was say, right, you've got 10 minutes to do your presentation, and people would say, oh, but 10 minutes, I need 45 to go through the literature review. And my view is, if you can't say it in 10 minutes, it's probably not worth saying, and getting the key points across. It's this Volavon principle. If I've left you with anything, it's hopefully the Volavon will come back as excellent cuisine. Yes, so we did say 140 seconds. They get picked up. People listen to them because they're quick and digestible, and they then read the article if they're really interested.
And it's a bit like the 3-minute thesis competition.
Yeah.
Tell me about your PhD in 3 minutes. What are you doing? Why does it matter? Why are you the person to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that's a good discipline for us all.
Asghar, did I answer your question as fully enough, or was there? Did you want to come back?
Yeah.
No, that was fine. Thank you.
Okay. But any way we can help.
So if there are no further questions, we can draw the session to a close. It will be recorded, it will be available, so you can go back and listen to it. Want to thank Justin for generously making his time available. I think the 2 sessions on sort of engaging with different types of publics have been, I think, very useful. We will be picking up some of these points about engagement, how to do it, identifying different stakeholders, those kinds of issues at the research festival, which will be happening in May, which sounds a long way off, but it isn't. And there will be, across the month of the research festival, sort of master classes running through the event, where we'll pick some of these up and be able to hopefully do some interactive sessions. We will be in term 2 looking at interdisciplinary research from the perspective of colleagues who are involved in interdisciplinary research. And the first one will be given by Dido Green, who is our Professor of Occupational Therapy. It'll be towards the end of January. I'm just trying to negotiate negotiate that with Dido. So we'll let you know as soon as that's around. And I think her title is Going Digital, Remaining Human. And I think it's how she learned to talk computer science. So that should be very entertaining and enlightening. So thanks very much, everybody, for coming along, and enjoy the rest of the day.